All right, ready?
Sure am.
Hi, welcome to Cyphopod. My name is Cory Clark, and I am no longer an assistant professor of social psychology at Durham University, just for the weekend, or not just for the weekend, forever. But I started a new job on Monday. It's very exciting.
Wow, I am also no longer an assistant professor at Marietta College. It
You
seems
are
as though
for,
our fortunes are probably quite different, though.
yeah, mine was by choice, but um, oh wait, you didn't introduce yourself.
Oh yeah, I am Bo Weingard, no longer assistant professor. Well, I have 20 days or something of assistant professorship in front of me. I am broadcasting from a quarantined, whole, undisclosed location in Marietta, Ohio.
Weird, so am I.
Yeah, it's strange. How does that work out?
Huh.
Your
Um,
wall kind of looks like my wall for whatever reason.
we must have similar taste.
Yeah, that's weird.
So today we're going to talk about whether social psychology has had a positive or negative influence on the world. I posted a Twitter poll a few hours ago, and last I looked at it, I think we were approaching 1,200 votes, and I think about 40% of people said that it has been more harmful than helpful. And then I think it was something like 20% said it's been more helpful than harmful. 20% said neutral, and then maybe 20% said they didn't know what social psychology was. So at least my Twitter audience seems to think that social psychology has not been positive for the world. Um, Both Bo and I have PhDs in social psychology, um,
We sure do.
but we've both been quite critical of it. So
I guess we should point out that the audience of people who took the poll is definitely not a representative sample of people who are interested in the social sciences.
definitely not. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
Okay, so what would make one say something so apparently extreme as social psychology has actually been worse for the world?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you even have to ask the question is not great. Like you wouldn't say, has biology been good or bad for the world? Because so obviously biology has been good. Probably same goes for chemistry, same goes for art, same goes for history, same goes
There
for
are
English.
Yeah, there are very few disciplines that I think you could accuse of being worse for the world. So maybe we should step back and ask, or yeah,
What
what are our criteria here if we're going to have the conversation, right? We have to,
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of this like in terms of everything social psychology has caused. Um, you'd want to look at what knowledge has it generated. That's obviously what it's trying to do. It's
right?
trying to generate knowledge, help us understand humans better and understand. Maybe we should tell people what social psychology is first. Not everyone knows.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a good idea.
yeah, so social psychology is obviously just a branch of psychology that focuses, for the most part, though not entirely, on situational factors that influence human behavior. So people's social environments, but also their physical environments. Um, it's kind of, would you say, it's situations that affect people in similar ways, rather than focusing on individuals and individual differences. You look puzzled, so
No, I
you
wouldn't even accept this definition of social psychology.
okay. That's sad. Okay, what would you say?
I mean, that's what I say to my students, though, is like social psychology is almost impossible to define because it sort of prides itself in studying all of human social behavior, which means almost anything humans do because humans are exquisitely social creatures.
Yes, and social psychology does touch on just about every single conceivable topic
Right,
of anything that humans do or think,
right,
relationships. But like classic social psychology things would be like things like conformity,
right.
um, or media authority. So those are like social environments that influence people's behavior.
Yeah, I always say like conformity is one of the most primitive social processes because it's an effect on human behavior that is inconceivable without sociality, right? So I think that's why conformity is like a good example of just like a very rudimentary kind of sort of social psychological effect. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's classical social psychology. But modern social psychology, you find people studying signaling theory, morality, political biases, etc. So it's really a very broad
Health.
field.
Yeah.
Yeah, yep, that's right.
Even like things like persuasion. It kind of covers everything. Yeah.
Yeah, it
It's the
covers a lot.
psychology of everything. Yeah, so in terms of evaluating social psychology, has it been positive or negative? I think the one thing, probably the biggest thing you want to think about is, has it generated good information?
Right.
And that's a complicated one because social psychology is, I think, really the field that sort of kicked off the replication crisis, and concerns about whether all of the social sciences replicate.
Yeah.
So that's suspect. We can talk about that.
Hmm.
But then I think also the findings, the things that we've been wrong about, how harmful have those been?
Yeah.
How much time and resources have been wasted? Have we been pushing any narratives that are damaging for society more broadly? Those are things I would think about. But then, like, maybe we've come up with some clever methodologies that can be used. Um,
So going back to the first part. So I agree that the first criterion by which somebody should judge a science is on the information it has given us about whatever topic it's attempting to understand. And so social psychology is interesting in that, as you noted, it was one of the sort of centerpieces of the replicability crisis, right? And there seems to be a couple of reasons. And so what that means is that a lot of the results in social psychology, a lot of the classical studies people wrote about in textbooks didn't replicate when they attempted to replicate them. There seems to be, there's at least, well, there are probably multiple reasons for it. But one thing that's interesting about social psychology that I don't think you got as much in cognitive psychology, neuropsychology, etc., is a reliance on cute studies with small sample sizes. Do you think that that's a fair statement?
Yeah, we definitely seemed to prioritize things that were sort of shocking, or surprising in kind of like an adorable way. Like
Right.
what comes to mind, like a classic example of that is the like fart spray studies. So like making people complete a survey in a room that smells like fart spray makes people judge people more morally harshly. And
Yeah,
that
so what was the let's look at that one a little more carefully because I think that actually is like a good example of the problem with social psychology. So what you have here is a theory, and the theory is that disgust, the human emotion disgust, is it affects moral decision making and moral attitudes, right?
Mhm.
And that it's implicated in a lot of moral judgment. So, for example, it might be that I think prostitution is disgusting, and therefore I judge prostitutes harshly. So then the idea was, well, if that's the case, if we somehow create a state of disgust that's
Mhm.
not related to the judgment in a person, it might make their judgments more harsh, right?
Hmm. So it's
And
part of
so,
the embodied cognition literature, the idea that a
which
lot
is
of,
a disaster, by the way.
well,
Can think about
it,
that, but
it's chunks of it are a disaster, but
right,
the whole
right.
thing isn't wrong. Um,
So
the
that so the idea is we
fart
induce
spray
this
and the
state of
fish smells.
right. So the idea is we induce this state of disgust with a spray that smells like a bad fart, I guess, right? Yeah.
Hmm.
So they would do this and then they would have people judge moral transgressions or maybe homosexuals or
That was one of them.
homosexuality.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you can see here, which is like, you have a theory that's reasonable, at least the sort of broad theory that disgust is an important human emotion related to moral judgment. That's a reasonable theory. It makes evolutionary sense, it's plausible, etc. Instead of testing that theory in a way that's difficult but careful, right?
Like how?
I mean, I don't know. I'd have to think about it. It's hard to test a lot of these things, right? And that might be one of the challenges that social psychology faces. But there are ways we could do this, or instead of writing a theory paper, I'm sure somebody did write a theory paper, so that's not fair. What you've done with this one is like you use something that's kind of funny in a sort of puerile way, fart spray, right? And then it seems kind of cute that you could get somebody to write on a survey, yeah, homosexuality is like, I don't know, 1.2 times, not times, but 1.2 more harmful if they've been induced with this spray. And the problem there is that, well, there are all kinds of problems with it, but that's a good example, right? This is what we're talking about, is these kinds of cutesy studies. I thought you were going to go to, and the example that I would give is the one in which people were primed with things that reminded them of old people, Florida, things like that. And then they had to, I can't remember exactly how this works, but they walked across like a hall, basically. And then people timed how long it took them to walk from like one area to another. And the idea was that when you were primed with old people, you walked a little bit slower because I guess you sympathized or identified with old people in some way, shape, or form, right? Or you were preparing to interact with old people, and the way you interact with people is by mimicking them in some way, shape, or form. So this was, and it kind of sounds silly because it's like, even if it's true, what does it mean? It's hard to know. This thing, as I recall, it's been cited it's well over 1,000 times that the paper that has that priming study has been cited, right?
The old people one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably right. And the fart spray, the whole inducing disgust, moral judgments thing, that is like a whole area of research on its own. Like that is some people's expertise. I'm sure a handful at least of job talks were given on that idea. Right. So those things kind of ran wild for a while. One problem is that the way we try to approach understanding human behavior with these laboratory studies, we end up using all kinds of weird methods and manipulations and measures to get at the thing we're really interested in. And a lot of it is probably out of convenience, right? Like priming is just really easy. And
yeah, I think it's out of convenience, and also, again, what I think is perhaps, well, I don't know if it's more pernicious, but the desire to be cute is like clearly a strong factor in here, because if you write one of these papers and you show that like the environment subtly influences people's behaviors, I don't think anybody thinks that's world shattering. Like, yeah, that seems pretty obvious, right? So you have to do something cute that shows it. And so there are ways of doing this. One thing that you'll find in social psychology, and I would bet that this holds up. I haven't tested this myself or looked into it, but I think social psychologists also tried to come up with very clever titles for their papers. Do you think that would be?
I'm one of those people.
Yeah, so I remember there was one called, and I mean it worked because I still remember it was called "Smells Like Clean Spirit."
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah. And so that's one thing. So you get all of these things where you're basically.
I think that's a positive contribution of social psychology. I'm in favor of taking things too seriously, being clever.
Oh, no, I don't have a problem with being clever. I think the problem is that it's sort of an indication of the underlying disease. It's kind of like a symptom of the underlying disease, which is this desire to be cute rather than to be careful, thorough, the things that the things that we would actually want from a science, right?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because why would that start to happen in the field in the first place. It's almost as though to get attention from everyday people or something. Like maybe we wanted our articles to be talked about in the media or something. Why would that become a norm?
I have a theory about this, but it's an elaborate theory, and I want to save it for a little bit.
Okay.
So maybe, but we can, okay, so we've got this, so this is part of the replication problem, right? We have this desire for being cute that's probably trumps rigorous methods. We had this problem where we used incredibly tiny sample sizes. So this is something that's just absolutely perplexing when you read articles from like these classic effects from like the 80s or from even the 70s where you would have 17 people in a condition, right? And they would be making these extravagant claims because 17 people in, at Princeton in psychology, you found an effect with those people.
Yeah, those were the days.
Those were the glory days. So you have this problem. And so all of this adds up to a replication crisis. The replication crisis.
I think what happened more with the replication, well, not more, but one major contributor was that so we do a lot of studies online. We do a lot of studies that are really sort of simple and easy. And so it just makes file drawing so easy because you didn't really waste that much time or energy or resources on an individual study.
Okay, so
So
let's explain what file drawing is.
yeah, file drawing is just when you have, um, let's say you're trying to test for a particular effect. You run 10 studies and you find a significant effect in four of those 10. You take those four and write up a paper and submit it to JPSP, and you just don't tell anyone about the other six that
Right.
did not show the effect or show the opposite effect or whatever.
Yeah, and
Um,
so let's be clear here that significant effect in psychology is literally an arbitrary designation. We cut it off at a statistical value, p equals 0.05 or lower. So basically what you get is a bunch of researchers who look at the results and they're hoping that their result says p equals less than 0.05. And if it doesn't, that is irritating. And it's like, what do I do with this? I don't know. And sometimes you get it where it's p equals 0.4. And then you're like, oh, didn't work. Notice the language, which is bad language for science because didn't work shouldn't be really used. But people say didn't work, throwing it in my file drawer. And so what can happen is hypothetically, you could run like 22 experiments, find an effect 3 times and get it published somewhere. And then the other 18 are just put away somewhere and nobody knows about them. So that is another thing. And you're right, the sort of lower the cost, the easier it is to do 20 studies and toss out 18 of them.
And I suspect the average social psychology study, and I could be totally wrong because, of course, I only have expertise in one like narrow area of social psychology. I would guess the average study costs like a few $100. And if you think the average study these days is online, the average study takes an hour.
An hour, really? That seems long.
At the time it takes you to program an Unqualtrics.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah.
I guess if you add in the analyses. Anyway, from beginning to end, it's taking you maybe like 8 hours.
Yeah, so this also contributes to replication problems because a lot of these things actually weren't even replicating when the lab was doing them. It's just nobody knew about it because they weren't published and the researchers didn't say anything about it. So we have this problem. Now, we also have a bias problem, but let's focus on this problem for a moment because I think I know you're skeptical of this, but I'll run it by the audience, see what they think too. I have a broad theory on the problem here, and my broad theory is this. Mostly what happened in social psychology is, in a lot of cases, you had reasonably plausible ideas that you would take too far or extend in certain directions too much, and you would try to run these cute studies about them. And nobody really cared if they replicated or not, because the theory itself is probably correct in one form or another. So it doesn't really matter if one particular manifestation of it replicates or not. And I'll give you an example of this. So there's an idea of costly signaling theory is a popular idea that moved into social psychology. And the idea was basically that men use various kinds of conspicuous consumption to impress women for mating purposes. Fancy cars, expensive paintings, Rolex watches. And so what would happen is a social psychologist gets a hold of this idea, and it's like, okay, how do we test that? And how do we test it in a very cheap way, right? How can we do this in a way we manipulate what we need to manipulate, so we can do the lab study, and then we can say we manipulated it, but it's not too difficult. And so what they would do is they would do priming studies, right? That way you're manipulating something. So you put one person in a condition in which they're looking or they're reading a story about a pine tree or something, and another person's in a condition in which they're reading a story about going on a date with some very fantastically attractive member of the other sex. And then after you do this priming, you ask them, how much would you spend if we gave you $5,000? What items would you buy with it? And then maybe you give them a list, and some of the items are utilitarian items, such as a plunger or paper towels, and some of them are conspicuous consumption goods or luxury items. And you show, oh, when you prime them, they pick a few more items that are conspicuous consumption items, right? Now, I read the study and I think, you know what? I don't really give a shit if that particular instance of the testing of the idea replicates, because the basic idea is probably correct. And this, I think, is why so many people really didn't care about attempting to replicate a lot of these things, because either they were true and not that interesting, and if they weren't true, it didn't tell us much about the world anyway, because probably the broader theory was true, right? That's kind of my idea on this. Now, I'm open to, there may be a few things that don't follow this pattern, but I think most of them do.
Yeah, that might be kind of true. So it could be that like moral disgust and physical disgust are related in some way, even if fart spray doesn't make you judge people
Right.
more morally harshly. And it could
Right,
be
exactly.
that priming like definitely works in the real world in some sense. Like you might find yourself singing a song that you heard earlier in the day and you didn't even
Right.
register that you heard the song, and you're like, oh, why am I singing the song that I haven't heard since 5th grade? But it's because it was playing in this good grocery store or something. So all of the, I mean, yeah.
I mean, I'll give you even a more interesting example, perhaps. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Robbers Cave study.
Mm-hmm.
We'll call it a study because it's not really an experiment. This Robbers Cave study is something, it's taught in every social psychology textbook. These kids went to this cave, this park in Oklahoma. They weren't told that there was another group there. They bonded together. And then they were told there was this other group, and they competed for a limited amount of prizes. And the story, as it's told in the sort of traditional social psychology textbook, is they were very tribal and they hated the other group and they rated them lower on things. And in fact, at one point, they burned the other group's flags, blah, et cetera, et cetera. It's supposed to illustrate like human tribalism.
And how easy it is to like get people to hate other groups of people exactly. when they don't even know them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it happens in young kids, right? Well, it turns out that Muzafer Sharif, who was the sort of principal investigator here, had tried to do this study a year before. And I think he might have even tried to do it 2 different times, and he failed to get what he wanted out of the boys. So, like, in fact, actually, the boys displayed more sportsmanship than he was hoping they would. So they were like nicer to each other, et cetera, et cetera. I think
that's kind of shocking.
I'm not actually shocked by that, because it's like, I mean, look, there are complicated things we could get into that, but what's interesting is like nobody really cares if the like how it was accomplished, because we do know tribalism is a thing and that people are tribal. So it's like,
Mhm.
well, the details are more complicated, or maybe it's a little bit harder to make boys be tribal, but tribalism is correct, and what Sharif argued is correct to at least some degree, right? It seems as though that's the thing. Is like, even though we now know this, we have explicit documentation of what happened here, nobody really cares that much. It's not a big deal. It hasn't caused us to be like, oh, wait, the Robbers Cave study from 50 whenever it didn't actually go down the way it was taught in my social psychology book. I have to update my views about humans.
Right. Yeah, one thing probably a lot of social psychologists are guilty of, probably myself included, is like we're not even necessarily being theoretical a lot of the time, and you're just like making observations in the real world and then coming up with a study to test it. And so, yeah, probably these things are really true. And then you're just like, I need to find a clever way to show it in the lab and then give it a name as an effect or something like that. And you definitely get that.
Right. On
Um,
top of that, I think social psychology is something that our folk psychology system
mhm.
is already pretty good at understanding human social behavior. And so you can see what scientists like is they like effects that are counterintuitive in some sense, or that
Mhm.
the average Joe wouldn't just talk to his friend about, right? And so it's complicated when you have this field that's dedicated to a study that you kind of evolved for. I mean, we evolved to be social psychologists to some
Mhm.
degree because it's really important to understand social behavior.
Mhm.
So I think that's a problem, and that you end up just getting these theories like humans are tribal or whatever it may be that are pretty intuitive, and nobody really cares that much if you don't replicate something because we know it's true. We know humans are tribal. I mean, what degree they're tribal, how easily you can make them tribal. Those are important questions. I'm not trying to poo-poo them, but if one study replicates or doesn't, or I mean, because I think about it this way. This could be wrong, but in general, a principle of mine is that if you run a study and you find no effect and nobody cares about that, that's dangerous because it means you're only going to look for studies that find an effect, right?
Um,
So I'll give you an example. In behavior genetics, if I do a
mhm.
study and I find that the heritability of IQ is 0, that would be really important. No matter what I find, the result would be important and people would care about it, and I wouldn't just put it in a drawer somewhere. On the other hand, if I do a priming study and I find that, in fact, men don't buy more luxury goods when you prime them with dating
Mhm.
stories, that's not important. Nobody cares.
Yeah, our null findings are often uninformative, which
Correct.
is a problem as well, I agree.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think the reason our null findings are often uninformative is because everything we do is so imperfect. The thing we're manipulating is never the thing we're really trying to manipulate. The thing we're measuring is never
Right.
really the thing we're trying to measure.
Right.
So we just say, oh, must be that scale's not the right scale, or that manipulation isn't the right manipulation, or whatever.
Right. Right.
Like,
So video games. So we do this things where we'll do like, does this contribute to violence? And so there are two things. There's the independent variable. That's the thing you manipulate. The dependent is the thing you measure. So what we really care about is violence, but we might
mhm.
use a dependent variable that is how much Tabasco sauce do you put in somebody's tomato juice? And it's very unclear how that relates to violence that we care about in the real world. And so if I don't get the effect, who really cares? Like, I don't know what that means, right?
Or like the manipulation wasn't salient enough. Maybe people
Right,
didn't pick up
exactly.
on the thing. Yeah.
Right. Right. So there
Yeah.
are all sorts of ways you can explain away a null effect, and it's not clear what it means. It's almost never clear what it means when you're doing like the kinds of studies that people do in social psychology. So we have this problem that it's unclear to me, and I think you would agree with this before getting into the bias thing. It's unclear to me how much social psychologists have contributed to the world that we didn't know already, or that we wouldn't know just because we're good intuitive social psychologists?
Yeah, a lot, but not all of social psychology are things that an everyday person, if you ask them to like guess what is true, they would guess the thing that social psychology would show.
Yeah, and there are some famous counterexamples, right? So the Milgram study is the one that comes up the most because in fact in the Milgram study he asked people
Right.
how many participants will go to the end, and I think everybody he asked said you're going to get nobody.
And he
Nobody.
asked social psychologists.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So that's often given as, I guess you would say, a counterexample to this that's mostly intuitive. And we can talk about the Milgram study. I think it has problems, but it's at least something. But yeah, so quite, how much have we learned? Like I always do this one. I say this to people, and I'll challenge people who are watching or listening to this to think about this. What is the most important theory that has come out of social psychology, and like what have we learned about humans that because of social psychologists? Like what's the single most important theory that's enhanced our understanding of human social behavior?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I actually was looking at all of the CESP winners for the most important, the most impactful papers for the past 25 years, and I will look through the list
Mm-hmm.
just because those should be the most impactful papers, so those should be
Yes,
some of the best
you
ones.
would think so,
The
right?
first
Yeah.
winner ever was the Kunda motivated reasoning paper. And
Okay.
even though I think a lot of people already knew that motivated reasoning was a thing,
Right.
hundreds of years before philosophers and other people were talking about it, I think like giving it a name and kind of talking about it in a
Sure.
review in a sort of systematic way is pretty
Yeah.
helpful.
Yes.
And
Agreed.
it's just correct too, which is
Yeah.
nice.
I think motivated reasoning is an important thing that cognitive and social psychologists have done a good job of bringing attention to. So that might be a good example of something that I would applaud.
Other ones were in like the persuasion research, and maybe that's been kind of important, understanding how people persuade people. The
Possibly.
elaboration likelihood model
Hmm.
is
So
pretty good.
maybe there are a few things there, but then
And
like
Roy's need to belong was on that list. And again, that's one that like everyone already knew people had a need to belong.
I'm going to write
But
an article, Need for Water, and hopefully I win the
humans
physiologist's
like
most
that.
prestigious award. Yeah.
Yeah, but like, yeah, so people already knew that, but to put it in a review
Well,
paper and
to be fair, one of the big debates that was going on around that time was about what is like the sort of fundamental human motivation. And there were terror management theorists were arguing that sort of fear of extinction was the great motivator of human behavior. And then the Baumeister and Leary camp were arguing, no, it's like more about human belonging. I
yeah.
would rephrase that into human status. I think if you look at like what they're actually getting at, it's like the desire for human status or prestige or something. So yeah, that's kind of where that comes from. But of course, nobody's going to read the need to belong and have their mind blown, which maybe that's okay. That's fine. Sometimes science, carefully goes over things that we kind of intuit already. So I'm not necessarily complaining too much about that. So maybe we should say, okay, so we can talk more about are there problems there, but where I think both you and I would agree, you get bigger problems that distort our understanding of the world. And then, which we'll get into what we also think probably is the bigger problem with social psychology is the way that it diverts resources from more productive ends. And that is the biased aspect, the political bias in social psychology. So do you
Yeah,
want
and I
to?
was actually thinking that probably is even relevant to the reason that the fart spray things went on for so long, because they were using it to explain why people might morally judge homosexuality or why they
Right,
might have negative attitudes toward immigrants. So these
right.
are issues that are like big deals to liberals. Um, and what you or at least I think a pattern you see, and I would again, we need a more systematic analysis of this, but the findings that continue to persist in social psychology for a long time when they're wrong or they're really tiny, um, they're probably things that are pleasing to liberals for one reason or another.
Right. So when we say political bias, what we mean is that somewhere roughly like 93% of social psychologists identify as socially liberal. And we think that this distorts the field in various ways. And we've talked about it before, and many other people have. But one thing that I guess what I would say is this. So human social behavior and human social psychology is not necessarily liberal or pleasant to liberals, and therefore it creates problems. It creates problems when you have people who are who are desirous to find effects that support, buttress a liberal, even progressive worldview. And you're pointing out like maybe the discuss sensitivity one does, but we can talk about other ones that are definitely, I think, examples of liberal wish lists, right? So those would be, I think we talked about these in our paper. So they would be stereotype threat, implicit bias or implicit attitudes test, IAT, and all of the outgrowth from that, and then like growth mindset. So we can let's take the stereotype threat example just because I think it's a good one. This did win the SES award, I think, twice. Is that not correct?
It was two different stereotype threat papers.
Stereotype threat, yeah. So
it makes up like 1/7 of the most influence of social psychology.
That's impressive. So the idea behind was 2 out of 21, right?
Oh, have there been 21?
I thought that's what you said, but maybe not. I guess it's not that important. Yeah.
It hasn't been given that many times.
Okay, so stereotype threat, the idea behind it is this. It's that minority groups usually, but whatever group is stereotyped, is terrified or worried, maybe would be a more charitable way, is worried about confirming a stereotype. And that worry about confirming a stereotype actually causes them to perform worse on whatever activity. And at one time, there was even like the idea that maybe this would affect sports behavior and other kinds of things. But really, as we saw it used in the lab, it really started to focus on two things: women's mathematics performance and African Americans' performance on high stakes testing or cognitive ability tests, right? And so the idea is, now we should say in the actual scientific literature, claims are a little bit less bold than they are when they get filtered into the public. But the claim was basically at least some of the gap in performance between men and women on math tests could be explained by this fear of confirming the stereotype that women aren't good at math, and at least some of the white-black cognitive ability gap could be explained by blacks' fears of confirming the stereotype that they're not as intelligent as whites, or they're not as good at tests, high-stakes tests or whatever. So this theory, which I maintain doesn't even really make that much sense on its face, but some people would disagree with that, I know. This theory is appealing, I think, to liberals and progressives because it suggests that some of the difference between a perceived victims group, women or African Americans, and a perceived privileged group, men or white people, some of the gap in their performance is caused by stereotypes and not by something intrinsic to the populations, right? Which is the great taboo, I think, and the great concern that liberals have. And so, in fact, this is something where you can blame the gap. Not only is it not something that's intrinsic, but it's actually caused by prejudice ultimately, right? Because it's the prejudicial stereotypes that's causing.
Yeah, they would be stereotypes that must exist for a wrong reason.
Right, they must be wrong.
Yeah.
And they're probably stereotypes that are promulgated by the powerful privileged group, possibly for the purpose of holding down these groups. So these effects, I mean, it's it's no exaggeration to say that stereotype threat is one of the most successful social
Mm-hmm.
psychological theories and is touted. I mean, you can find people talking about these in the media. You can find it everywhere. As sometimes it's proffered as an explanation for the entire gap.
Mm-hmm.
Like we could just get rid of these pernicious stereotypes. We would get rid of the entire gap between this group and that group in some performance or another.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so that's a good example. And why don't you describe growth mindset perhaps? We can
Well,
talk to.
just to like conclude that one, the literature on it is pretty mixed. There have been several meta-analyses now. Some say pretty much there's nothing there at all. Some say there's something there, but it's in particular kinds of domains. I don't think we fully have the answer as to whether stereotype threat is actually a thing or not. It might be, but if it is something, it's probably pretty small. The effect size is pretty small and it's not doing much in the real world. So in terms of like, what did we gain by 30 years of stereotype threat research? How many people have put in how many hours trying to understand this thing? And what have we gotten out of it? I would say almost nothing, maybe. We have like a question mark. Is this a real thing or not? We've been chasing it for 30 years. And I don't suspect anyone who's genuinely interested in trying to help like women or minorities performance in whatever domains. They wouldn't say, let's solve stereotype threat, because that's not really doing much, if anything at all.
Yeah, right. So let's if we can try to hold off those thoughts for a moment because so there are two things that we care about. One is are we increasing our knowledge of the world? And the other is are we wasting resources, time, energy, etc. on something that is not true, or if it is true, it's not explaining much, right? I mean, those are kind of two separate things. And so your point about stereotype threat is that in the literature right now, there's a question mark about it. But if there is any effect that's true, it's a very small effect, right? No, nobody's arguing that this is a large effect at this point, I don't think.
No, I don't
I
think so.
would, yeah, I would go so far as to say it's a very implausible theory on its face. The effect sizes are tiny, especially when the things are actually high stakes. And furthermore, it seems as though there's publication bias. The meta-analyses that have looked at this issue have found that publication bias might be able to explain any effect that you have. Furthermore, even if you really get an effect, it's unclear that it's not related to demand characteristics, right? So there are all kinds of problems there. Have we increased our understanding of these gaps by exploring stereotype threat, right? Which would be my question. And the answer is, I think, no, we haven't.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that, but not everyone would. So, not
Well, not
everyone.
everyone would agree that the Earth is round.
Plenty of people in social psychology probably still think stereotype threat has contributed something to the world.
Yeah, that's my point with the problem with social psychology. But uh, so we have that, we have the implicit bias stuff, and we have growth
Which we talked a
mindset.
little bit about with Calvin
Yeah, so
a couple
let's
weeks
you
ago.
you want to talk about growth mindset for a little bit because I think we can easily transition from that into also our concern with social psychology, which is the waste of time, energy, resources.
Yeah, growth mindset's another one that got pretty big, and I think growth mindset is actually interesting. Um, I don't think you got too many interventions from stereotype threat. At least they didn't become as popular as you got with growth mindset.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that's right.
anyway, growth mindset's pretty. It's just the idea. So you have the idea that it's really just the idea that people can improve in a variety of ways. So you have, I don't know, we don't want to talk about like entity and incremental theories probably.
Well, it's the idea that people can have different kinds of different mental beliefs. That's a redundant. Different kinds of beliefs about can you improve or can't you improve,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and individuals who believe that you can improve are more likely to improve, but not only that, but also like teachers who believe that people can improve, their students are more likely to improve. So it's the idea of having this growth mindset, um, that just having that mindset alone can actually lead to performance gains.
Right.
I think there might have even been ones with parents, where I think if the parents had a growth mindset, supposedly that helped the children, but now I'm doubting whether that's right. Anyway,
Right.
the point
But
is
it's
it can happen in the mind of the individual, but it also can happen in the minds of people in their environments.
right, right.
And so that got really big. I think that paper had been cited, what was it, like 7 or 8,000 times, maybe more.
It's a
Um,
lot.
yeah. Um, and not only did it get really big in psychology, and not only are people still working with it, but it caused all of these interventions, these growth mindset interventions. Of course, people doing interventions want to test whether their interventions are effective, and I think they've mostly not worked out. There have been a couple of cases where interventions had small effects, but a lot of the time they do these really expensive, these really big interventions and find nothing at all.
Right.
Um, so that's another one where I think we're left with a pretty big question mark. Is it a real thing? Does it do anything at all? After all of this time, do we know anything about really does growth mindset help? And I think we don't know probably.
I mean, yeah, we probably don't know. Here's something just to think about on that. This sort of not related to the overall theme of this, but I do find it interesting because in a lot of it actually does follow a similar pattern in a lot of these kind of ideas forwarded by social psychologists. So like for this theory to work, this idea that your mindset about your talents or the way skills are developed or etc. The idea is if you have like one view, it really you can become much better at something, and if you have another view, you won't become much better. It suggests that humans are fundamentally irrational at something that they should be very rational about, right? One of the things that you would expect evolution to produce in humans is a pretty good understanding of how they can achieve status and what they're good at and what they're not good at, and a sort of gauge that would cause them to allocate their time and energy accordingly. So this theory comes along and says, no, actually, these people are fundamentally wrong about how good they can become or how somebody gets better, and they don't work at something that would have massive benefits to their life if they just did. I just find that remarkably implausible on its face.
I don't know if that's necessarily fair because it could be that, say, math is something you're not particularly good at, but let's say math is the thing that's the most important to being successful in modern society. It probably isn't, but let's pretend it is just to
Right.
think through this.
Okay.
Um, then if you're not good at math, evolution could have said, like just in general, anything that people aren't good at, they should not dedicate a lot of their time. Maybe you're really good at something else, and that's something you could get status for, and you would evolve a tendency to
Mm-hmm.
invest your time in things you could be good at.
Right.
But math is so you would actually not want to work as hard on math. You wouldn't evolve something that would be specific to the domain that's the most important for success in modern society. I don't think I'm explaining this well, but like
I mean, I think self-control matters here, but this what you would expect is that humans would be creatures that are pretty good at deciphering how to get status and
mhm.
then allocating their time and energy to maximizing their ability to get status, right? And so the reason that you get people moving into mathematics, for example, in Western societies is precisely because you do get status if you're particularly good at it. I doubt it's a behavior that humans would do in absence of potential status from it, or at least like advanced mathematics. There are very few people I know who would, let's suppose nobody got status for it. I don't think many people would pursue math. Do you?
If people did not get status for it, they would not. Yeah, probably
Correct.
not. But you would
Right.
admit
So I
people
think,
don't behave in the perfect way to get status,
sure,
right?
no, they don't, because I think
People are like pretty lazy.
yeah, because I think self-control matters here, though. But here's what I think is generally happening. I think people who are not good at something or who don't improve at it tend to have an quote entity belief. That is, they're like, well, practice isn't doing anything for me, so why would I waste my time doing it? And you know what? That's a perfectly rational response. Now, you could come across and say, well, look, it's so important that people are good at math that even though they're basically right, that it's not really doing a lot for them, they should still put their nose to the book and try to squeeze whatever juice is left in that fruit. That might be true, but that's it's actually irrational in many ways. And I think we should just be more honest about it instead of pretending that if you had this kind of view, I'm getting off track here, but you see what I'm saying? Instead of pretending that this, like, if you just had this right view about things, then you would perform better. It would be better just to be honest and be like, look, yeah, people who work on math at home and they get good at it, they're like, yeah, that's how you get better. Sweet, right? And that makes sense. So it does make sense that they would have that view. Also makes sense that if you come home with your calculus book and you never get better at it because you can't understand it, your view would be you don't get better when you practice something like this.
Yeah, but I mean, presumably in general, practice helps with just about everything.
Well, no, that's not true. Like, it depends on what we mean, right? So, like, if I practiced a certain kind of practice, sure, I will agree with that. But I think what's important is the amount of return you get for the practice, because there's always opportunity cost.
Sure, you want to make sure you're using your time in a
Okay,
wise way.
That's sort of a side point anyway. So I think the theory is implausible on its face, and I don't think the evidence supports it. And I think you think it's...
Yeah, maybe it's something, but not much.
Right, not much. So again, people often use this to explain disparities between whites and blacks.
I would like to know how much money has been spent on these interventions. That would be useful.
Right. So again, this is something in which theorists use these things to attempt to explain gaps in achievement, right? That's where I often see it. So the reason that, this particular school, on average, the people there are failing and the people at this school are successful is because of different attitudes toward improvement, right?
Or at least partly,
yes, at least, right? And so again, this is something where my argument would be it doesn't get us a lot of purchase on reality. In fact, it's probably mostly crowding out better explanations of particular gaps. And so again, it's a failure of social psychology to do like the bare minimum that you want a science to do, namely help you understand the world.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, these are a couple effects in all of social psychology. And as we said, social psychology touches on just about every single thing.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But we think these are part of a pattern of things that don't replicate, that we think probably don't replicate because they're things that liberals would really, really want to be true.
Right. And these are also, to be fair, these aren't just like obscure effects that you might find in a footnote on page 222 of Baumeister's social psychology textbook. These are very prominent, eloquently championed theories in social psychology. And so my concern here is to illustrate that neither stereotype threat nor growth mindset nor implicit bias does a lot to help us understand social behavior and social disparities. Right.
Yeah,
And that's
I
what
would
it's
agree with
trying
that.
to do. That's what these theories are attempting to do, is allow us to explain some of these things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Um, I'm trying to think what theory in social psychology does explain a lot of whatever it is trying to explain.
Well, I think some of the theory, like motivated cognition, and some of the like height inspired understanding that reason is often used strategically, those kinds of
Hmm.
things, I think actually do explain a lot of puzzling behavior, or at least
Yeah,
potentially.
too. Although, yeah. Um, anyway, so do we want to think about
So what we're saying here, and this is, I'm going to condemn social psychology, because that was like the fundamental question here was, is social psychology, has it been bad or good? I mean, in total for the
mhm.
humans. I will say it's been,
Oh, we didn't talk about power opposing.
oh yeah, that's another one. Yes. To be fair, power opposing is one that doesn't attempt to, it doesn't really attempt to explain something important in the world. It's more of an intervention based
Yeah,
thing.
it was like a solution thing. And I think it was
Right.
mainly for like how can we get women to,
Yes.
ask for a raise and be more,
Right. Because I don't
yeah.
think the idea was, oh, if only you power pose, you would be like Gal Gadot or something. I don't think
Yeah.
that was the
But I
attempt.
do think it's something liberals would like because they think it's
Yes.
something that could help women, especially coupled with the testosterone finding. Like power posing makes women,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The idea is that if only women would sort of harness their inner Wonder Woman and do these magnificent power poses, they would behave more like affirmative men, right? And they would ask for that raise and get more money. And they would say, no, I'm not going to do that for you. I'm the boss here, or whatever it may be. And again, it's a denial. It's not completely, but there is a lot of these things have in common, is that they're a denial that there's actually like more of a biological explanation for the disparities we're looking at, or for the behaviors we're looking at, right? It's sort of fleeing from that.
Yeah, and I think this was I actually don't remember if it was in Diego's and Jay's comment on our paper or not, but like, does social psychology just have a preference for like these kinds of social environmental explanations because that's what social psychology is? And so everything they look at is going to be sort of, it's not denying that there are other reasons for differences, but that's
Mhm,
just not what the focus of social psychology is. Now, I think
mhm.
that's not entirely true. The field is generally social and personality psychology, and personality could be
I mean,
focusing.
I don't think it's remotely true. So the
I think
claim
it's
is,
somewhat true. Like that is what social psychology is. It's supposed to be, it's not looking at genetic differences. It's not looking at hormones, really. I mean, although some social psychology does, but
sure. So to be clear, the claim here is, well, it's not that social psychology is liberally biased and therefore is looking for these environmental causes. It's rather that the very nature of social psychology is social. It's looking at social context and trying to use that to explain behavior. The reason I say that that's totally false, or at least it doesn't work as an explanation for these kinds of effects, is because there are all kinds of things in which social psychologists actually go out of their way to argue there is not a social effect. And the most prominent example here is homosexuality, but also transgenderism. I think social psychologists would go out of their way to deny the idea that showing a transgendered person on television might make other people want to become transgendered. And in fact, social psychologists get very angry about the contagion theory. Maybe we don't need to use the word contagion because I know people get upset about that. That's not what we mean by it, but just social influence theory.
yeah, I suspect you're right that like liberal social psychologists would not like a theory that suggested that that like exposure to trans individuals could cause more people to go that way. But
Right. So it's
that
just,
doesn't mean that social psychology as a field doesn't heavily study social environmental factors that influence behavior. It does. That's
well,
probably
no,
90% of what they study. Maybe not
right,
90, but
right. I agree, but that doesn't, you could imagine a social psychology that says, you know what, the gap between men and women on in computer programming, for example, is caused by intrinsic differences in, I don't know, desires. And those differences are men are more oriented towards things that are analytic and systematic, and women are more oriented towards things that are living. We should accept that and then talk about interventions that would work with that underlying biological reality. You could do that. Right?
yeah.
There are all kinds of ways you could do that. And I do find it fascinating that a field that supposedly, you know, like it argues that everything from test scores to your actual performance in the world can be influenced by the most subtle of things in the environment. If you suggested to them putting a gay person on TV and making that person a famous character might influence other people's sexual behavior, they would find that probably grossly bigoted, I would imagine. Now, I'm not saying it's true that that would have any influence, but it is interesting that a field that emphasizes social influence then denies it in those kinds of cases. And I think the common thread that runs through this, the thing that makes it all make sense, is political interests.
Yeah, but maybe denying the importance of social variables in some contexts is the bias and not exaggerating it in others. I don't think I believe that, but it's possible.
So I think the bias is in both directions, and I think conservatives would do the same thing. It's just that conservatives aren't in social psychology by and large. And
Yeah.
so I don't think that argument, I've heard that argument a number of times. I don't think it's a particularly persuasive argument.
I think
I,
it's a decent argument, but I don't think it's 100% of the story, though maybe it's part of it. Um,
okay, fair enough. We'll agree to disagree on that. Now, so has social so let's think about this. Like to me, social psychology, not only has it not helped us understand a lot of these disparities, it's actually caused us to misunderstand them, which is the thing that to me is so disconcerting. And you look at fields such as psychometrics deals with like mental testing. They've actually made so much progress in 120 years. So if you went back to 1900 and you look at 2020 and you ask like what's psychometrics done for the world, they've done a lot. Like we understand a lot more about the world. We understand a lot more about why some people get differences, you know, like some people are wealthy and some people are not, why some people succeed in college and some people don't, et cetera, et cetera. Psychometrics has allowed us to understand that. If I ask the same question about social psychology, I would almost have to say it's caused anti-knowledge because it's actually distorted our understandings of a lot of these things. Now, that doesn't, again, it's important to say, like, that doesn't mean there aren't any areas that have helped us understand the world. There are. It's just that the sort of mainstream social psychology story is on whole wrong and actually distracts from better explanations.
Yeah, I wonder how much of this ties into what Calvin was talking about a couple weeks ago about the like the media sort of making social psychology findings seem more important than they really are and spreading that knowledge out into the world before it's really ready or before we really know what's going on. Because it does seem like a lot of the most famous findings out of social psychology, growth mindset, implicit bias, stereotype threat, power posing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people knew about the fart spray thing. um,
Yeah.
and that also wasn't like that influential. But
Right.
like those kinds of things, they they got big not entirely because of social psychologists, but also because people liked them.
Yeah, no, I
The
agree.
media liked them and people
Yes.
liked them. And so they
Yeah.
took those findings, and so it's not necessarily all social psychologists' fault.
Yeah, no, I actually think that's important. It's important about that is that you almost have to treat the media as a sort of appendage of the scientific system. And it's worth noting that the media, at least the mainstream media, and a lot of the media that write about the science are overwhelmingly liberal, possibly even more liberal than the scientist. And so this is one thing, it's another reason why people aren't very familiar with psychometrics, and what they are familiar with is often laughably incorrect. And so, I mean, I think if you ask the common person about IQ tests, they would tell you there's sort of like there are shenanigans, and like there are all these problems, they're biased, et cetera, et cetera. These things that everybody who actually knows the literature in psychometrics knows is wrong. And the reason for that is because of the media. It's the way the media promulgates results and the way they discuss certain topics. So that is definitely true too. However, I don't think the social psychologists can escape culpability for these things, because it's not as if they're not out promoting them. And I've read a few of these books. So I think we talked about this with Kelvin. I forget the name of the book. It's like Before You Blank or something. It was the book about the IAT and implicit biases, and they certainly made some provocative claims in there that I don't think they held up at the time. Then there are popularizers such as Malcolm Gladwell and others who maybe distort it or simplify it, or at least professors have argued that they do. So yeah, no, I mean, I will agree with that, but I don't think that exculpates social psychology.
Yeah, the thing that I find to be the most harmful, like obviously it's not great to put anti-knowledge out into the world and for people to think things are true that aren't true. That seems to take a really, really long time to correct. As far as I can tell, the replication crisis has been going on for how long? Like 8 years?
Yeah, probably about 8 years.
And I don't think we've been able to undo probably most of the damage that's been done. But I find like the particular set of findings that get popular in social psychology, like the implicit bias is really the one that sort of bothers me, because if it's wrong, I suspect it contributes to like cultural problems. I'll take the example of the one from the Nozick paper, which is the idea that the implicit attitudes held by a community potentially negatively impacts women's ability to perform well in mathematics.
Right.
Okay, so if that's not true, we're basically saying like society has these negative attitudes about women and it's causing them to fail in these really important areas. And that would, I think, anger women. And it kind of, you're sort of blaming other people for women's performance. And if that's not true, it seems to be contributing to a sort of like harmful or divisive idea that society is like harming women when they're not necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like I think, so we can transition to talking about other kinds of costs than just the truth. So here a problem with social psychology is I think the problem here, and this is related to what you're saying, is that social psychology is in some cases little more than an arm of the progressive ideological movement. And so it makes these very divisive political claims that actually do cause, or could cause if they're wrong. If they're right, they're right. Whatever the consequences, fine. But I think we both agree that they're probably wrong in many of these cases. They're very divisive too. And so I think it's bizarre, and we've often talked about this, and I've talked about this with other people. You forward a hypothesis, part of the cognitive ability gap is genetic, and people are like, well, what if that could cause all these bad consequences? What if it does? People don't ask the same question about these other theories that so here's a theory. Everybody is, or no, almost everybody has implicit biases against one race. And because of that, that race performs worse in our society. Well,
Hmm.
think of how divisive of a theory that is. It's a really nasty theory if it's wrong. You're suggesting that because these people have these biases that are somewhat irrational, it's actually causing another group of people to perform less well than they should.
Hmm.
That would cause the group that performs less well to be angry, rightfully, and it caused the
Hmm.
other group to feel guilty or defensive, rightfully. Probably
Hmm.
guilty is the response they should have, right? So yeah, it's like that's a very consequential and I would say deleterious theory if it's wrong. And
I
so yeah,
I was just saying, I remember when I was first taught about it, and it was taught very much like um, people no longer report explicit prejudice towards groups, towards different races, towards women.
right,
Um, and but that doesn't mean people aren't still really prejudiced. We
right,
now know we have this implicit measure. And so to me,
right,
it's interesting instead of it being like a victory of modern society to be like, look, 50 years ago, people would say these really horrible
right,
things about other races or about women. And now they don't do that anymore. That's awesome. We've made progress. Or
right,
like, no, it's still really bad. And we have this other way of detecting it. Um, and again, if it's real, if implicit bias is a real thing and it's really predicting prejudicial behavior, which I think the research shows it's probably maybe not. If that were real, that would be important and useful information. If it's not real, it's, I think, probably just causing a lot of tension between groups and um, I think contributing to more like societal. I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but um, let's say it's not helpful for like social harmony to have
right. And
that narrative if
agreed.
it's
And
not right.
right, if it's not right. And let's, I think what happens here is that there's clearly a view among most of these people in the media and among most social psychologists that obviously groups would perform equally if everything were equal socially, right? Because they don't accept that there are any genetically caused differences. And so you get this time in American history in which people are not reporting explicit biases. If you ask them, would you care if your daughter married a black man, and they say no, I don't care. Would you care if you lived next to a black person? No, I don't care. Would you care if a woman was in your programming group? Nope, I don't care. So then they're like, well, if these explicit things can no longer explain it, because to these people, they just think it's a given that it must be some kind of bias or prejudice that's causing this, then you have to go search further. You
Yeah,
search
but you can
elsewhere for
there are
it,
so many other potential explanations that I don't even know that you have to go straight to
such
prejudice.
as, such as,
Like differences can be due to like differences in schooling or a
well,
million
people
different
do look at that.
cultural
People, yeah,
differences.
people do look at that. People
Yeah.
don't like cultural though because it seems to quote unquote blame the victim.
Well, it probably depends how you think about it or frame it, but I
Sure, but I think people are reluctant to criticize. Well, I'll just give you an example. James Flynn, for example, is very explicit in his criticism of urban culture, and he thinks that it does actually depress African American IQ. And people don't like that. People are not happy with that theory because it seems to quote unquote blame the victim. And so, but you're right, schools, but people do look at schools. I mean, that's a theory that's often forwarded.
Yeah, I mean, my point is really that there are many kinds of explanations you can look at, and what I think you do see in social psychology is like a preference for prejudice, which is
Yes, I
sort
think
of
that's right.
puzzling.
I don't think it's puzzling though. I think it actually makes straightforward sense. Again, if you assume that these people are motivated to believe that all groups are essentially equal. And also they're very reluctant to quote unquote blame the victim group. So it's like they are going to find prejudice-based theories much more palatable ideologically, right?
This is Jessam and Honeycutt. Their comment on our paper was essentially this idea, right?
Yes, right,
That liberals dislike any explanation for group differences that isn't prejudice.
right.
Which I think is probably I think we said we think that's probably not entirely correct, and that it's actually they prefer explanations that don't blame groups that aren't performing well in whatever domain.
Right. They don't like things
like we said, if it was like a climate explanation, like this group had this horrible hurricane and it's created problems in this particular region,
right.
I think people would be fine with that because it doesn't blame anyone.
Maybe. I mean, I think to be charitable to the social psychologist, now, I think social psychology is kind of a disaster, but I'll try to be charitable for a moment on the prejudice one, which is there really was a lot of prejudice in the United States 80, 90 years ago. And so it's not, and also social psychology really grew out of the Holocaust, right? I mean, that was one of the sort of defining events that many social psychologists were attempting to understand. So if you look back at classical social psychology, Ash, Milgram, Sharif, etc., they were all very influenced by the Nazi regime and trying to understand how could a country that was at basically the peak of Western civilization, right? I mean, you think of Germany, you think Beethoven, Kant, etc. How could that descend into the barbarism of the Nazi regime? And so it does make sense that you would be looking for prejudice, you would be looking for these social explanations, etc. I do understand that. I think what bothers me is there's this modern social psychology just seems so much as though it's just an appendage of progressivism, and it's so reluctant. I mean, if you think of these theories, they tend to be theories that blame society for almost everything. And it's interesting because if you make a theory that, we've made a lot of progress, like think of the reaction to Steven Pinker's arguments about making progress in Western society. Social psychologists greeted those with many of them, not all of them, but many of them with absolute disdain, because it's like this suggestion that, yeah, actually Western civilization is pretty cool and has done a lot of good things, and we're a lot better than we were in the 60s, and actually people don't have these nasty attitudes. In fact, if anything, they actually want minority groups and women to succeed, like that's something that's, I think a lot of people would like to see. That, again, that's not to say that you can't go in the Appalachian Mountains and find legit old school racists. You can, but is society as a whole racist? And so I don't think it is. I think it's actually quite the opposite. And so, yes, this is a very divisive, almost anti-social. I mean, it's almost against the social order because it's progressive. It's basically an appendage of progressivism.
Yeah, I think it's difficult for people when they see something that is so important to them, in this case, like, even if there's any shred of racism left in the country or sexism left in the country, and as you said, there definitely is among certain people in certain places, when that is like the most important thing, it's hard to admit that we've made progress because it seems to be like belittling the problem that remains. So I kind of understand why it's difficult for people to do that, to admit things are pretty good when they still see there's so much work to do.
Yeah, but it's a really weird thing, and I think it's actually a sort of dangerous propensity, because if things are getting better, it's useful to think about why they're getting better.
I agree.
Right? And to look at like, well, what did we do right?
Yeah, what has worked so well?
Right, exactly. What has worked? And also, I think it's like you have to compare things to plausible alternatives. So if you're going to criticize, and I understand like youth are going to criticize the status quo. That's sort of like what youth do, and like you're a little bit irresponsible about it. But when you get into your 30s and 40s, you have to start to think responsibly about what's the plausible alternative? So you can rail against capitalism all day, let's say, but if you don't have an alternative that's better, that's actually a dangerous attitude, because you're criticizing something that's not perfect when all the alternatives are worse. And so
I
I
don't
think
know. Like maybe it's good for some people to do that and other people can do the other thing, and that's how we have
well that yeah
balance. Like
okay
we
that
want someone to be criticizing everything and we want someone else to be defending it, and then we want other people being like, "Hey, you're both kind of right."
yeah. Well, okay, that's fair. I would accept that. The problem with social psychology is that you don't have that kind of a balance.
Yeah. I completely agree, and I think a lot of the problems in social psychology aren't necessarily problems, and they wouldn't be problems if we didn't have the completely liberal, 93% liberal, um, what am I trying to say?
If the
93% is
composition weren't 93%.
if
No,
there was someone to push back, and
I
like
completely
I
yeah.
I end up being a person who pushes back. Like I think people think I'm one of the most right-wing social psychologists.
Wait, but that
Which is maybe true, but if so, that's pretty pathetic.
right. I mean, to me, that illustrates a serious problem, which is like, I think people think I'm borderline fascist and I'm a centrist and I'm probably liberal on, I don't know, we'd have to go through the issues, but on a lot of issues, because I'm in academia, or I made a short, brief, unsuccessful stint in academia. And like, that's a problem. That's a problem that in many ways I'm one of the more conservative people I know in the field. So you're not getting the balance. And this has been the case for a long time. I mean, I think social psychology from the beginning was kind of activist oriented, right? I mean, if you
Yeah.
think about what you were doing, you had the Zimbardo prison,
Hmm.
quote, experience. And a lot of that was just flat out oriented toward criticizing the American prison system, and it was associated with a very strong anti-prison movement. And it's like, okay, that's just flat out activism. And that kind of activism, so a lot of people might be thinking, well, look, there are a lot of these kind of social psychology wonks who are just doing good research. They're not writing about it for Vox or for the Wall Street Journal or for whatever, for any media, the Atlantic. They're just doing good research. Yeah, there really are. There are. The problem is they're sort of drowned out by this sea of people who promote their work prominently in these kinds of outlets, and then it just becomes a kind of activism. That's what I see it
I
as.
mean, one thing we should point out, and this is, I think, something we talked about when Diego was on, um, was that most social psychology actually doesn't have relevance to politics or
Yeah,
things that
that's
liberals would
fair.
care about. Like all of the like relationships research, that's probably not so related to politics. The moral stuff all is, but
Yeah.
even some cultural psychology wouldn't be related. Health psychology wouldn't necessarily be related.
To be
What
fair, a
else do
lot of the
people study?
relationships research is shit. It really is. Like the dude, I can predict divorce just by seeing who rolls their eyes in a video. Bullshit. Come on. I mean, that's just
I am unfamiliar with that paper.
oh no, it's not a paper. There's
Oh,
anyway. Yeah, but you're right. There is it. That's true that a
there's
lot of
probably good
social,
relationships research though.
yeah,
Like
for sure.
um,
I would imagine.
McNulty, right, has some good stuff. Like what predicts people breaking up.
Yeah, there's stuff that's. I mean, yeah, there is stuff in
Anyway, the
sort
point
of.
is most of social psychology wouldn't be susceptible to liberal bias because probably most of social psychology is not really relevant.
Yeah, so the areas that are not relevant are not vulnerable to it. Are those area? I mean, again, I, my challenge to people is to find me the theories that have been forwarded by social psychologists that have positively affected our understanding of the world, because like in other fields it's really easy to do this. Neuropsychology, for example, very easy to do it. Cognitive psychology, very easy. Psychometrics, very easy. Genetics, very easy. Social psychology, Not so easy. I would say the motivated cognition is probably, I would say that's the best example. But that's also kind of cognitive psychology, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's a little bit cognitive-y. Um, do we want to take a few minutes to say what are good things about social psychology? Or are you done? Does your list start and stop with motivated reasoning?
I think social psychology can be awesome. I think it could be awesome because it really is an interesting field of study. And I would even go further. And I know people like think I'm some kind of genetic determinist or something, but I'm not at all. I do think social context really matters for human behavior. And I think thinking about the Nazis is a good example of this, like trying to understand what kind of psychological forces would allow this kind of a regime to take over what was a completely civilized country and to lead to the heinous atrocities that it did. That's really important to understand. And that's not a genetic phenomenon. That's a social psychological phenomenon. I think the problem
And what social forces have led to so much progress in our attitudes toward
yeah,
people who are
absolutely,
different.
right. Or yes, like the fact that like we no longer think it's funny to casually make fun of people who are different from us or
Yeah,
who have
we're
cognitive
much more
challenges.
sensitive. Yeah.
Right, like I mean you think about
I
shit
wonder
that
how much of that is like international travel, and, like being exposed to different cultures and different kinds of people and being like, this is kind of cool.
there are various theories. Like if you look at, so interesting, this is not coming out of social psychology, it's coming out of sociology, I think, is looking at like Christian Welzel and the other author's name escapes me, unfortunately. They look at like the way that values change as you increase affluence, for example, and that's something that you find there's like a pretty regular and predictable move towards self-expressive values and away from more closed, safety-oriented, survival-oriented values. So that's an interesting thing, and you're right. These are things that are really cool and that should be studied. I think it is the case that the liberal bias is just like a poison that really causes a lot of systematic damage to a lot of these areas in social psychology. So yes, it is true that you have relationships research and other things that are largely immune from political bias because they're not related to it. But a lot of the coolest stuff that we would like to understand, such as how does an authoritarian take over a country, those are inevitably vulnerable to political bias because they're political.
Yeah.
And it would be hard to avoid and again, the important thing here is it's not that conservatives are better than liberals or anything. It's that as long as social psychology is overwhelmingly composed of liberals, you will have these bias problems.
Yeah, probably, unless you can get people to commit to some kind. There are other solutions, I think. I don't think the only solution is necessarily like decreasing the percentage of liberals in social psychology. One thing that I think social psychology attracts a lot of really like smart and cool people. Like it's an interesting field, and there have been studies. I think social psychology is one of the areas of I think even science in general that the general public is the most interested in.
That makes
So
sense
we're
because
studying
yeah.
topics that people really want to learn about. Like social psychology was my favorite class in my undergrad. Maybe my number one favorite class. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I was a little bit credulous or something at the time. But I thought it was really interesting. And
Mhm.
obviously, we both got our PhDs in social psychology. Um, and yeah, I mean, a lot of what it does is probably good. We've learned some things, and
I mean, I think one thing I will say is I was lucky in that Roy Baumeister was my advisor, and although some people have, criticized some of his work for the replication crisis and whatever, that's a long story that I obviously can't adjudicate here. It is the case that he's an interesting person in that he really does care about the truth, politics be damned. And so I enjoyed graduate school much more than life after graduate school because I was in an environment. And I will say, actually, I would go farther and I would even say the entire Florida State Department, I think, cared more about that. And so although it was overwhelmingly liberal, I was able to talk about a lot of things. And, I would get debate or whatever, but I didn't get the kind of, I think, unedifying feedback that you get some other places. So there are these pockets of very interesting things going on in social psychology. And I wish that, and when you get that, it's awesome because it really is an interesting topic.
I think what you get is a lot of, I think, like when you look at the field as a whole, it seems more biased than when you have individual conversations with social psychologists. Because when I have individual conversations with social psychologists, granted, I don't probably have a representative sample of friends in social psychology, but they're even the ones, I mean, again, they're all extreme liberals because everyone is. They agree that it's a problem and they can see the way it influences conclusions in the field. And though they don't talk about it publicly, most people don't talk about it publicly because ridiculing your colleagues probably isn't a good way to be well liked. Like criticizing the field that you're trying to participate in probably isn't a good way to be well liked.
I disagree with that. I think there's an element of cravenness that deserves to be called out because a lot of people criticize the field, like the replication crisis. Yeah. Lots of people love to criticize the field for that. What they don't criticize.
But a lot of those people get a lot of hate too. Let's be fair.
Well, okay, but to be fair, some of the people that get the hate are very, let's just say, aggressive, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I think the people who are much more measured in their tone don't get the kind of hate. I think it's a cowardice I can understand, but there is a kind of cowardice at play here because you're right. When you talk to these people one-on-one, you often have very enjoyable conversations with people who know exactly what's going on. They know the problem and they don't like it either. And they don't like the fact that they feel as though they're kind of muzzled. And you're right. The problem is it's scaling up where you get more bias. The system itself, social psychologists study systems. The systems are more biased than each individual person because everybody's afraid that that other person's going to call them out or tell on them or whatever the case may be. So yeah. I completely, and I think importantly, a lot of the tone is caused from the top down at some of these places. So I tried to think about it at Florida State, and I think a lot of what happened there is just you had professors who clearly weren't interested in a lot of that BS. And so that wouldn't happen. Like, I know Roy's not interested in that BS. And so like, you just didn't get the same kind of behavior wouldn't be rewarded in that atmosphere that it might be at like SPSP in general, where you can shout that this person's a bigot and then people will be like, we're not taking that person seriously. We're sorry we invited him, etc. Or her.
I don't think I've seen that happen at SPSB, but maybe it would.
Yeah, sure, that's fair.
We are at an hour and 33 minutes.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah, so I'll just end by saying that I like social psychology. I think it can be a really cool field. It has a lot of cool, really smart people. I think there is a silent majority problem. I'm not 100% sure, but I really do suspect that more social psychologists are kind of aware of the problems, particularly with the bias side of things, and the way that a lot of our findings are described publicly and what people take from them, and how that influences what everyday people believe in the world in a sort of negative way a lot of the time. If people aren't just being completely misinformed, they're also potentially being misinformed in ways that are potentially bad for society, I think. And I think a lot of people can see it, but people don't really want to talk about it. And I don't know how you get people to speak up. I think just more people have to have the courage to say something, and that's how you slowly steer the ship back.
I think that they had better, because I think social psychology's reputation is correctly declining quickly.
Yeah.
I think there are lots of people who just
I
don't
think
even
it
pay
was
attention.
Jeffrey Miller tweeted a while back that he no longer even like covers social psychology in his class. And I think that's
Yes.
happening more and more. People don't even think it's worth
Yes.
teaching, um,
Right. Which
which is
is,
bad.
yeah. And so if you're a social psychologist, you should care about this. If you care about the field at this point, it would be more healthy to criticize it and to attempt to correct course.
I think at least creating the illusion that we're being self-critical would be helpful.
Yeah. And I mean, there is a lot of self criticism. I think it's just,
Among a small subset of
yeah,
people.
exactly. Yeah. So my statement would be right now, social psychology is more harm than I mean, you would literally be better off if you just obliterated social psychology for the time being, which is a very painful thing for me to say because that means my degree would get obliterated too. But that social psychology has the potential to be a very fascinating, interesting, riotous, intellectual discipline. And that's what we should attempt to do is move it so that I don't want to obliterate it anymore.
Cool.